We have a number of guests here tonight, so I will let you introduce your guests if you'd like. We'll start on this end. If you don't want to, you just raise your hand. Let's start with the front table here. Any guests there? John, do you have any guests? Lyle, have any guests at your table? Okay, we'll start right here. Any guests? Okay, we'll move on back. Yes, sir. Hey, Ryan, welcome. In the back, any guests back there? One more. One more? Okay. Hey, Richard, how are you? We've had Richard before, I think. Yeah, thanks, Richard. Down here in front, George has got some guests.
George Ridings from Richmond. Glad to have my fiance Alicia. Our other guest speaker, Phillip Seyfrit, who's the curator of Battlefield Park in Richmond. Known him since high school time. Luetta Hetrick, I started to say Seyfrit, Hetrick. I just realized y'all have similar names. Luetta Hetrick is one of our great volunteers at Battle of Richmond. She will be manning the table with books. These books are, we got Hafendorfer's book on Richmond and Dean Warren Lambert's book on Richmond, which are reprints, but they're $35 each or 2 for $50, special tonight. So Luetta, you can see her afterwards. I'm glad to have my mom and dad, George and Judy Ridings from Richmond, and one of my 2 daughters, Emily, and my spliced-in almost son-in-law, Gus Benson from Richmond. I'm glad to have, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you all for being here.
Okay, let's keep going here in the middle. Any guests in the middle here? Back table. Okay, let's go over here. Any more? Just raise your hand if you'd like to introduce any guests. Yes, sir.
My guest is Bob Jordan. Bob is from Tennessee, works in telecommunications and healthcare, mainly in Tennessee. He now is retired and lives in Lexington. Before he started his business career, he was a football player. He played at the University of Memphis, and he went on and played some in the NFL.
Oh, really?
Very knowledgeable Civil War person, especially about the Tennessee battles, and he's a volunteer and help National Guard.
Great. Glad to have you. Okay, we forget anybody? Okay. Oh, okay. Hi, Mary Beth. How are you? Glad to have y'all. So, we like guests to become members. So, if you're interested in membership, see myself or Susie at the end of the meeting. We have membership applications, and we'd love to have you. So, we have George as our meeting sponsor this month. In addition, George is our newsletter editor, and I want to compliment George. We've never had such great newsletters content. I don't know what y'all think. The May edition, he just totally outdid himself. So if you haven't, we brought some here. Most of them are electronic now, but we did bring some if you want to pick one up and read it. So we're down to our September and November meetings this fall. And then we will be invoicing everybody in August. So be looking for that. I know you're anxious to get that. But we got to keep the ship afloat. So, and another way we keep the ship afloat here is recruiting sponsors for meetings. So we've had 2 sponsors so far this year. We need 2 more. And for the nominal price of $500, we will feature your organization, or we'll give you advertising, we'll allow you to distribute your literature, however you want to do that. But without the sponsorships, the dues just don't cover the nut hairs in this organization. So keep that in mind if you're interested. We'd love to talk to you. We lost one of our members, Russ Tucker. I don't know who, if y'all know him or knew him. I think he's been a member a couple of years. So let's just have a moment of silence for Russ. Okay, without much more to say, we will be planning, the board will be meeting in June, trying to plan for the next future of the organization. If you have suggestions or ideas for speakers or activities or things that we ought to do different, let us know. And we're also recruiting board members if you're interested. If you're interested in being a board member, see myself or AJ or George or any of the members that are here. So I'll introduce George. He doesn't need an introduction, but I'll let George introduce he himself and Mr. Seyfrit who will be our speakers.
You will use it. Good evening. It's an honor and a pleasure to get to speak. The programming year that Kent lined up this year, we started with Perryville in September, talk about the history, but also the preservation movements. And so he thought it was a good idea to bookend with the two closest battles, the two biggest battles in Kentucky. And so it's our honor to be able to do that tonight. We have one other guest that will be joining us in a little bit. Richmond Mayor Robert Blythe will be joining us. Battlefield Park started off with the Madison County Fiscal Court back in 2007. And Phillip has been the only employee of the park during that tenure. And then 2023, a process of transferring the park to the city of Richmond began. And so Mayor Blythe will be joining us in a little bit. So if Mom, Dad, if y'all, when you see him slip in, if you can, he can come sit in my chair because I won't be back there till we're all done. I'll be up here the whole time. So afterwards, if you could come say hi to Mayor Blythe when he's here, since we're not going to, we'll acknowledge him when he comes in at some good point, but just so you know that he's coming in. We do have a couple of items over here on the table that Phillip has brought from our museum. How many of you have been to Richmond to the Visitor Center where the 3-inch ordnance rifle is sitting out front, which is the museum? Thank you. And I know many of you were at our reenactment last August. We'll be doing that again this August. And we had a living history in the spring, so I have seen some of you all there, and some of us are from Richmond. Mr. Richardson and these fine folks over here are some other Richmond folks. We have over here the commission of Bull Nelson to be Major General, signed by President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton. That's over here on the table, so when we're finished, be sure to come by and see that because you don't get to see a Lincoln signature very often. We had a supporter that got that at auction. We were able to work out getting that on permanent display. We also have a parole over there, original document. There's two September 3rd, 1862 newspapers. The Battle of Richmond was in the New York Herald and the Philadelphia Inquirer, and those are original newspapers over here, so we've got a few things for you to look at. We didn't bring guns and swords to pass around, but we thought we'd just share that with you. So it is my pleasure to introduce Phillip Seyfrit. We both are graduates of Laboratory High School in Richmond. We were in the band. And Phillip had a career in funeral services and other things before, but he became involved in living history and reenacting in the 90s. And then when the park opened up, he was the natural guy in Richmond to be the park curator and has been the only one. So he's the founder, inceptor, and has done many things. And up here, there's some T-shirts hanging. I know you all in the back can't see them. I brought them just for fun. He has been very creative on doing a lot of marketing things and doing a lot of program things. If you're a Facebook person, if you don't follow Battle of Richmond, look it up and please like it. But we did concert tour shirts for the generals. So we've got Bull Nelson's tour, Edmund Kirby Smith's tour, and Patrick Claiborne's tour, which of course 2 of the 3, only one made it through the war. So their tours were kind of cut short, although Claiborne at least made it to 64. So on the back it has their battles, on the front it's got a funny picture of them. So that's, if you're like, why is that hanging up here? Just to let you know, we don't do just history stuff in August and we sit around till the next August. There's always something going. He's also arranged a bunch of Chautauqua type programs at Mount Zion Church, which was on the core of the battlefield, was a field hospital. So follow the Facebook page. That's the primary place to know what's going on. But we have a lot of you who've come down over the years and look forward to having you more. So with that, I want to bring up Phillip, and we'll get him hooked up on the microphone, and I'll get everything switched over. So thank you. Give us just a moment to get technologically ready.
You may remain seated. Well, I understand from listening to several of you all that you don't have any officers here tonight. When the cat's away, the mice will play. So it's a great honor for me to come here to speak to you. I've been a lot over the eastern United States, talk about the little old Battle of Richmond. And so let's get ready to take a journey. We're going to go back to 1862. We're going to go to a battlefield where the dust never settles, even in 2025. But before we go to talk about the battle, we have to know what's going on. We have to set the stage. So during the American Civil War, the summer of 1862, let me stop real quick. This is our mayor of Richmond, Robert Bly. Hello. I was kind of hoping to get my part over with before he got here, since he is my boss, but those things kind of happened. But during the American Civil War, the summer of 1862 witnessed the Confederacy having success in the Eastern Theater. Now, real quick, George put this together. I have not seen it. If there are objectionable photographs in there, that's not me. Ladies, I will have to say someone's name 2 or 3 times that could be offensive. But Braxton Bragg is part of the story. So, all right. Confederacy having success in the Eastern Theater and far less than spectacular results in the West. In the East, Robert E. Lee and the newly named Army of Northern Virginia has repulsed George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac during the 7 Days battles, and Lee is beginning his first invasion of the North. However, Confederate forces in the West have lost Forts Henry and Donelson in northwestern Tennessee with over 10,000 much-needed troops, and have been defeated in April at the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, otherwise known as the Battle of Shiloh Church, resulting in well over 1,000 Confederates killed, including the Confederacy's overall commander in the West, Kentuckian Albert Sidney Johnston. Albert Sidney Johnston's from Washington, Kentucky, just outside of Maysville. That's where he's born. Guess who's born in the same house? A fellow that comes in later, his name's William Bull Nelson. They're 2 different generations, but they're born in the same house. Kind of cool, you know. P.G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter and First Manassas, took over Confederate forces, but was forced to abandon the vital railroad hub of Corinth, Mississippi, and retreat southward. This left nearly all of Tennessee and northern Mississippi in federal control. Confederate generals Braxton Bragg, replacing Beauregard as commander of the Army of the Mississippi, and Edmund Kirby Smith, commander of the Department of East Tennessee, soon to be known as the Army of Kentucky, met on July 31st, 1862 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, to devise a plan while there was yet still time for a brilliant summer campaign to rid Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and Kentucky of the federal occupiers. Bragg, with 30,000 men, would quickly bypass federally occupied Nashville and march into west central Kentucky, basically up this I-65 corridor. No, I-65 was not there then, but it gives you an idea where they're going. Thereby cutting Federal Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio supply lines, while Kirby Smith's 23,000 soldiers would advance into the east central region of the Bluegrass State, placing a significant enemy on Buell's left flank. Basically, they're using the I-75 corridor. No, the I-75 was not there then. You'd be surprised how many people will. I don't know why they had so much trouble getting up here. Hey, got a good blacktop road out there. Thank you. Kirby Smith, a Florida native educated at West Point, left for Kentucky from Knoxville on August the 17th. Concerned with an entrenched but poorly supplied federal garrison of 10,000 troops on his right flank at Cumberland Gap, Kirby Smith dispatched Brigadier General Carter Stevenson. Carter Littlepage Stevenson, the longest general's name in the whole war, with 9,000 troops to keep those federal troops in check. Problem is, Kirby Smith didn't know those troops were starving because they didn't have any supplies, so they weren't going to do much. Meanwhile, Smith's other 3 divisions slowly made their way through the drought-stricken mountains of southern Kentucky. Meanwhile, Federal Major General Don Carlos Buell had received word of the impending Confederate advance and sent Major General William Bull Nelson to see to the defenses of that important supply-laden city and to meet and repel any Confederate invasion of this Kentucky. Nelson, a 37-year-old native of Washington, Kentucky, just outside of Maysville, a United States Naval Academy graduate. Now let's stop right there. When you think someone graduates from college, you think they're there about 3.5 to 4 years, correct? Come on. I feel like I'm working at the funeral home again. Bull Nelson was only there 6 months because the Mexican War breaks out. And they go to the Naval Academy. They're needing experienced officers. So they graduated some fellows that had a lot of experience. And he was one of them. And he's a Mexican War veteran. He takes command with his usual vigor, only to find the troops available for the defense of Kentucky to be very inexperienced men only recently mustered into the service from the states of Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, with sections of Michigan artillery. There's a little inherent problem now also. Nelson hates people from Indiana. He says people from Indiana is just poor white trash from the mountains of Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina. But Nelson has to command the troops that he's given. Now, not completely sure of Kirby Smith's intentions, Nelson sent 2 brigades under Brigadier Generals Mahlon Manson and Charles Cruft, who are both from Indiana, to Lexington and then on to Richmond with 7,000 men with orders not to bring about an engagement without the surety of success. Now, in the interim, Kirby Smith's Confederate cavalry commander, Colonel John Scott, and his 900 troopers, mostly from Louisiana, top-notch cavalry guys. To show you how tough they wore rattlesnake rattles on their hats. This is the upper crust of Louisiana. What? They reached Big Hill on August the 23rd and routed the Federal 7th Kentucky Cavalry, under Colonel Leonidas Metcalf, whose father was governor of Kentucky, and they called him Stonehammer. Home still going on, still stands in Nicholasville. Or not Nicholasville, Nicholas County, sorry. Now, Scott didn't pursue the Federals due to the appearance of Federal infantry in Richmond arriving from Lexington. And he's gotten way far ahead of Kirby Smith, the main force. He's gotten out there a little bit too far. Now, using the main north-south route known as the Old State Road, today it's US 25 421. That helps you a little bit if you're familiar with Richmond. Kirby Smith's lead infantry units crossed Big Hill on August the 28th and moved into Madison County in the Bluegrass region. Captain Alfred T. Fletcher of the 12th Tennessee recounted, "We pretty soon commenced ascending a very rough high mountain. The road was quite rough most of the way, and what was not rocky and rough was shoe deep in loose sand." Private Sam Thompson of the Douglas, Texas Artillery Battery said, "The country is mountainous and sparsely settled, and poor people who have but little to subsist on. We are now short of rations." Kirby Smith's 4th Division commander, Brigadier General Patrick Claiborne, was in the lead, and he moved his men all night over Big Hill, with Brigadier General Thomas Churchill following with the 3rd Division. Kirby Smith's other divisional commanding officer, Brigadier General Henry Heth, where have we heard that name before? Gettysburg. He didn't like it out here, so he went back to Virginia. Was a good day's march south from the other 2 units. Claiborne, a 34-year-old Irish immigrant with extensive experience in the English Army and hailing from Arkansas, was a veteran of Shiloh, where he had showed great talent and was the most experienced of Kirby Smith's divisional commanders. Churchill, a Jefferson County, Kentucky native, served as postmaster of Little Rock and had fought at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. And I know what you're thinking. Is he kin to the people who did Churchill Downs? Very, very, very distantly. So, Claiborne moved his men within sight of Bobtown, just south of the village of Kingston, when word reached him of the federal forces just north of the small village. Colonel John Scott and his cavalry had had a rough scrap with federal infantry at an area known as Muddy Creek or Rogersville, a little over a mile south or so, a little bit mile north or so of Kingston, and were being pursued by the federal cavalry. Scott lost a mountain howitzer in this conflict, but led the unsuspecting Federals into a snare set by Claiborne's infantry at Joe's Lick Knob just after dark on the night of August the 29th. Casualties are very light on both sides, but the Confederates did retrieve 30 breech-loading Wesson carbines found strewn in the road with other equipment. Anybody know what a Wesson carbine is? It's a breech loader, and it was one of the first weapons that used a brass cartridge. And the Battle of Big Hill, Kentucky, if it's not the first, it's one of the first battles that a brass cartridge was used during the war. Very expensive. Aware of the fight at Muddy Creek, Federal Commander Malin Manson sent word to Major General Bull Nelson, who is in Lexington, informing him that the Confederates had crossed Big Hill in force. Nelson immediately sent by courier, no railroad yet, no telegraph yet, a reply back to Manson not to risk an engagement, but move Manson's force to Lancaster, approximately 25 miles due west. Unfortunately for Manson and the Federals at Richmond, the message came too late. The stage had been set for confrontation. Now, the story is that it took 4 hours for Nelson to get the message by courier, and it took 14 hours for it to get back. I've always thought there were a lot of brothels along the way or something. So, anybody know? At 4 a.m. on Saturday, August the 30th, 1862, dawn had broken clear and cool, but promised to be very hot. The region was in a terrible drought, and both man and animal wanted for water. Union Brigadier General Manson roused his troops, bivouacked at Rogersville, just north of Kingston. At 4:30 a.m., just as the rays of the hot summer day dawned, Kirby Smith issued orders to Patrick Claiborne to move his division forward from Bobtown and expect a meeting with the Federals around Kingston. Claiborne moved his division north upon the old state road toward the little town. Claiborne's cavalry pickets ran into Union cavalry pickets at the Crooksville-Lancaster Road intersection with the old state road at 5 a.m., forcing the Federals back after a sharp exchange. Now, if you look over here on this table, you will see part of a Dyer shell, which we took possession of today. And it was found right where this fight is happening. Pretty cool, huh? Receiving word of the cavalry skirmish, Manson sent word to his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles Cruft, who is still in Richmond, to bring his brigade to Rogersville as quickly as possible. Manson marched from Rogersville toward Kingston looking for the Confederates. They will soon find him. Confederate cavalry scouts have reported to Claiborne that the Federal forces were in a line of battle just south of a small church known as Mount Zion. Claiborne rode ahead to get the view for himself. Manson had positioned 3 regiments from Claiborne's point of view on the right side of the old state road and 1 on the left, with artillery in support a short distance from Mount Zion Church. Claiborne immediately sent for his infantry and artillery to come up. He placed Douglas's 1st Texas Artillery Battery on a high ridge just north of the village within a mile of the Union position. At 7 a.m., Manson ordered his 8 guns of Michigan artillery to open fire on the approaching Confederates. Confederate Colonel Benjamin Hill. The enemy commenced a heavy artillery fire upon our line and the village. Soon Douglas's 4 guns were in position and answering the Federals. Sam Thompson. We opened on the enemy with 4 guns, 2 12-pound howitzers under 1st Lieutenant James Boring and 2 6-pound guns under 2nd Lieutenant John Bingham. The enemy turned all of their artillery promptly on us. They had much higher ground and appeared well sheltered in their position. The infantry lay down to our left and rear, out of the danger of the enemy's guns, and the music of the two batteries rose to the grandeur of battle. Shells burst with great force about us, and their solid shots shrieked close to our heads with fearful accuracy. People don't write like that anymore. Isn't that good stuff? Federal Artilleryman Lieutenant Colonel Byron Paddock said the Confederate shot and shell began falling around us like rain. Confederate artillery struck the Mount Zion Church during the fusillade. Knowing the battle was about to begin, the church became a hospital, and it was set up in and around the Mount Zion Church in anticipation of what was getting ready to happen. Now, after a 2-hour artillery duel, it is now the infantry's turn. Claiborne's division of Tennesseans and Arkansans began moving up the right side of the old state road. This would be currently on the U.S. Army Depot property, to help you, and engaged the Union left. But Claiborne and Kirby Smith had a little surprise for the Federals. They instructed Brigadier General Thomas Churchill to take his division west on the Crooksville-Lancaster Pike about half a mile to a ravine north along a creek known as Mound Branch, and, most importantly, completely out of the Federals' line of sight. While Manson is being heavily engaged on his left, a near knockout punch is coming up on his right. Now, sometime during this action, probably about 9:40 or so, if we look at it right, Patrick Claiborne is severely wounded in the mouth and jaw. He gets shot, and he's talking to a fellow, and bullet comes through, hits him in the mouth, takes out 2 to 5 teeth, depending on the account. Now, everybody has Patrick Claiborne with a mustache and a goatee and all that. He didn't have that at Richmond. He grew that to hide his scar. And I found last week, apparently his scar was not really all that big. So that's, but he couldn't talk. So, unlike me. Manson, sensing his left flank was about to be turned, ordered most of the 69th Indiana Infantry Regiment to support the troops on the other side of the road, leaving only 3 companies on the right. So he's weakened his right flank to strengthen his left flank. These men witnessed nearly 3,000 Confederates, mainly from Texas and Arkansas, converge on their position from what is now known as Churchill's Draw. After a very short stand, these 3 companies of the 69th Indiana, probably no more than 200 men at the most, broke and the right flank of Manson's line collapsed. But General Cruft has now arrived on the field, and Manson ordered the 95th Ohio and then the 18th Kentucky into the fray to support the collapsing Federal left flank. The 95th Ohio charged on the right and were forced back with heavy losses. And unfortunately for the 18th Kentucky, they were soon alone in a sea of butternut, smoke, and blood. The Union's most experienced regiment was forced back with heavy losses. Now, on a rise half a mile north of Mount Zion Church sat the stately home of Adam Rogers, known as the Rogers House. As Manson and Cruft tried to stabilize the Union lines, this dwelling and area became a rallying and reorganization point for the battered Federals, whose wounded now packed the Mount Zion Church and Rogers House. Of course, we all know that the Mount Zion Church became a hospital, and it did suffer artillery damage. It's still very visible. And they're open beginning this coming week on Wednesdays from 1 until 4 if you want to come and see. Looks very much like it did then. Now, knowing the Federal forces were greatly demoralized and had taken great loss of life, Manson ordered the Federals to retreat to the crossroads of the Old State Road, Duncannon Lane, Speedwell Road, about a 1/2 mile north of the Rogers House. Now, here, the Federals would form a second line. Union General Bull Nelson, who is now in Lancaster and not aware that the fight had commenced, heard the continuous artillery fire to the east and immediately set out for Richmond via Paint Lick on the Garrett and Madison County border. He had 1 aide with him. And we discovered recently what the name of his horse was. Anybody want to take a guess? Poor horse. Bull Nelson is about 6'4", 300 and some odd pounds. The most elegant and original swearer in the entire Union Army. If you go to his grave in Maysville at night and it's real quiet and listen, you can hear him. Now, the Confederates, being hungry and tired from their several days' march and morning's heavy battle, did not actively pursue the Federals. They'd gotten rather disorganized during this. But after a short respite, the Confederates moved upon the Federals' second battle line. The battle for Senator White's farm has begun. Now, the problem with that is it didn't happen on Senator White's farm. But that's what Warren Lambert and Kenneth Hafendorfer said, and I argue with them, and they will not answer. So we just leave it alone. Now, all right. Right up here at the top, all this stuff here. Anyway, if you go straight to, I guess that'd be the left, going out down Canyon Lane, that's where Buc-ee's is, if that helps you. You know where Buc-ee's is? Have good fudge out there, don't they, Mary Bly? Mm-hmm. Cross Brigade, including 2 unengaged regiments during the Mount Zion fight, formed the far right flank of the Union line. Now, hoping to thwart the Confederate advance as they came upon another mansion known as Cumberland View, these Federal regiments moved forward, and as they moved forward, they also wheeled. Anybody in the military, they'll know, instead of going like this, they turn. Well, when they do that, they open their flank up, and they enter a whirlwind of Texas lead. These Federal units were severely bloodied and forced back, and the entire Union force retired in poor order to Richmond. The battle for Senator White's farm had ended about 1:30 in the afternoon on an unrelentingly hot August day. Now, an eerie silence now descends on the battlefield, pierced at times by the screams and moans of the dying and wounded. Both Confederate and Union commanders plotted what to do next. Federal troops were greatly depleted by battle and heat, and the Confederates likewise. But momentum is definitely on the southern side. As the first of the Confederates came within sight of Richmond, this is at Kroger's in Richmond. All right, if you're familiar with it. They heard a rousing cheer go up from the retiring Federals. General Bull Nelson had arrived on the field. Finding the Federal force resembling a mob instead of an army, Nelson proceeded to form a third and ultimately final line on a rise just to the east of the city in the front of a large stately mansion known to the locals as the Holloway House, still there. On this rise, across the street from the Holloway House, rested the dead of Richmond in the city cemetery. Here, Nelson positioned his troops in hope of fending off a Confederate advance until he possibly could evacuate his forces under the cover of darkness. I wrote this a long time ago. The more I've read about Bull Nelson and stuff, that's not in his character. So I don't know if I don't know exactly what he's doing. Does that make sense? Lieutenant James Cox of the 16th Indiana noted there was only a shadow of hope. Entering the outskirts of Richmond, Captain Paul Hammond of Kirby Smith's staff noted, "We found the enemy's encampment deserted by all but a few wounded men and the surgeons attending them." Proceeding farther into the city, another Confederate noted, "They had the prettiest line of battle I ever saw. It was formed in a grove of forest trees behind a fence. Their center was on the outer edge of the town cemetery and commanded a view of 800 yards. Not waiting for his artillery to come up, Kirby Smith deployed his battle-weary forces on either side of the road entering the town and moved forward into the Federal line, which was mainly south of the turnpike. And I'll tell you a little secret. The Confederates are going to move right through where Mayor Bly lives. Right there. As the Confederates exited a large cornfield, very tall and of full ear, the Union line fired a wicked volley into them. The Confederate advance slowed due to the stiffness of Union resistance, fences, and difficult terrain. Captain John Lavender, the 4th Arkansas, remembers, a company of officers of the regiment and myself went over the fence, being in front of our company. But when the men struck the fence, they turned in a full volley at the enemy. I had to back myself up into the lock of rails and stand as a post, facing the enemy, and perfect sheet of fire passing through the fence on both sides of me. Colonel Benjamin Hill, as we cleared a rise in the ground, the deadliest fire was poured into us that occurred all day. And although bullets hailed, our brave soldiers did not falter. A federal account reads, the Confederates reached a level clover field in front of our center when they received a volley deliberately aimed from behind our shelter. Without halting to return fire, with their arms at right shoulder shift, the veterans of a dozen battles pulled their hats closer to their brows, closed up their ranks, and pressed on, with lines dressed as parade. There was something appalling about the steady tramp of their approach that carried terror into many a man whose first experience this was under fire. Sergeant Henry Phelps of the 95th Ohio later recounted, "We fired briskly as the enemy advanced, but they did not scare worth a cent." As the Confederate line increased in its intensity, the Federal right flank collapsed and broke. Finally, the entire Federal line collapsed from south to north, sending Federal soldiers skedaddling through the cemetery and into the streets of Richmond beyond. An Indiana corporal said, "We were forced to give way," which we did with more speed than grace. Even General Nelson by now had received a wound in the fleshy part of his left thigh. Might have got shot by his own men. But remained on the field, angrily chiding his troops as cowards. But despite Nelson's continued attempts to rally his men, the rout was on. The main street of Richmond quickly became a morass of men, horses, wagons, equipments, and ambulances. But the Confederate leaders had another little surprise for the retreating Federals. Earlier in the day, we don't know exactly when, Kirby Smith had ordered Confederate Cavalry Commander Colonel John Scott to execute a wide flanking maneuver to the west in order to cut off possibly any potential routes of escape. Now, with the Federals in full retreat and heading out of Richmond toward the Kentucky River, the Confederate cavalry basically lie in wait. With few shots fired, nearly the entire remnants of the retreating Army of Blue were captured en masse north of the city. This is where Cracker Barrel is, in that general area. Okay? Because if you don't know today, you don't know what they're talking about then. Bull Nelson was able to sidestep the Confederate trap and make it north. Some of the Indian boys took another route north and made it to Winchester. Cruft made it to Winchester, but Manson was moderately injured when his horse fell on him and he was taken prisoner. The Confederate victory is now complete, and the road north to Lexington and Cincinnati was virtually cleared of any organized Federal resistance. But now Kirby Smith has a problem. Over 4,000 Federal prisoners that he wasn't planning on. Most of the Federals captured were kept in a makeshift stockade constructed of a fine ornamental fence that surrounded the Madison County Courthouse, the very same courthouse still in use today. And that fence is the exact same enclosure that lines East Main Street in front of the Richmond Cemetery, the very same cemetery that witnessed such furious fighting late in the day. Now, over the next few days, the Federal prisoners were paroled or set free with conditions at the Mount Pleasant mansion overlooking Richmond. On the table over here, we have an original parole from the battle for Adam Conover up in Indiana. Most churches, schools, and many private residences became hospitals for the well over 1,000 wounded, both blue and gray, except for the Presbyterians. How many Presbyterians we got in here? I figured out why the Presbyterians did not have any wounded. They didn't have time to form a committee to study it. I'm Presbyterian, so I can say that. And the medical personnel of both sides, along with the local residents and their slaves, began the task of burying the dead. Commenting on the treasure trove of supplies and equipment now in Confederate hands, one Texas soldier said, "Here I saw how they were being fed. Canned fruits of all kind, condensed milk, the first I ever saw, cheese and other edibles. They also had large quantities of clothing, shoes, hats, pants, all of which we put to good use. We were nearly naked. The pants I wore, coat I had not, was made of some thin material, and my canteen, haversack, and belt had worn holes on both sides, and in a short time they would not have held together. I confiscated a pair of blue pants, a gray army shirt, a pair of excellent shoes, and hung my old ones out on a fence." Would love to know where that was, where he did that. Now, several of Kirby Smith's commands were able to rendezvous with Braxton Bragg and participate in the largest battle fought on Kentucky soil, the Battle of Perryville in rural Boyle County in early October. Now, I'm a simpleton when it comes to Civil War battles. And I've had people jump all over me on this, and I still tell them, sorry, you're wrong. I classify Perryville as Confederate defeat because they leave. Whoever leaves loses. So Bragg leaves, and he goes back to Tennessee. And some Confederates withdrew through Berea and back over Big Hill. Now, the Battle of Richmond caused several events to occur. The Battle of Richmond resulted in Confederate troops occupying Lexington and the state capital of Frankfort, the only time a Union state capital fell during the entire Civil War. Lead elements of Kirby Smith's force reached as far north as Florence, Kentucky. They got to the water tower up there, causing panic in Cincinnati some 10 miles away. The Battle of Richmond is the only example of a federal force ceasing to exist when the battle was over. Basically, Nelson's entire command was either killed, wounded, or captured. All of the Union artillery, stores, equipment, and surviving animals were captured and put to good use by the Confederates. Total Union casualties were 206 killed, 844 wounded, 4,303 captured or missing. Now, Confederate losses were reported less fully, but it's generally accepted to be 122 killed, 519 wounded, and 3 captured or missing. I've yet to figure out at the Battle of Richmond how you can be a Confederate and be captured. Doesn't make any sense. But not all of the Confederate units reported their losses. Now, after the battle was over, they buried the dead. They concentrated them on the field. End of August, being a funeral fella, I hate to tell you, it's not pretty out there, and it's going to get bad fast. So they're basically concentrated on the field. They come back later. Now, I don't know what later means. Is that 2 months? Is that 6 months? I don't know. And they moved them to 2 mass graves in the Richmond Cemetery. But in 1867, the Union dead were reinterred in the new Camp Nelson National Cemetery in Jessamine County. And most of the Confederate dead are still in the mass grave in the Richmond Cemetery, with a few buried at the base of Big Hill near the ruins of Merritt Jones Tavern, with still others buried at Big Hill, Berea Cemetery, and in the Lancaster Cemetery. How was that roller coaster ride? Any questions? I'm not an expert on the battle. I'll tell you right now, I'm not. You might know something. You might know something. You might know something. You might know something. And hopefully all of us together, we know more than we do individually. Yes, sir, Hoosier.
So why did the Confederates leave after they won? Why did Bragg and the rest leave?
Where on the calendar?
Well, you said that afterwards you considered them to be the losers because they left.
Because they got too far from home. Bragg was concerned, at least now some of you Perryville aficionados, tell me if I'm wrong, which I probably am not, but Bragg was afraid that they were going to move south and cut him off from home. That was a whole thing, the whole time all these armies worried about is getting cut off from home. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes, sir, way back in the back.
How much land was lost to the golf course and construction of that?
How much is it, George? About 400 acres. About 400 acres when the Battlefield Golf Course came in, but that actually was what caused the preservation efforts, which I don't want to step on George. That's what caused everything to get going. And if we had to lose some battlefield land, losing it to a golf course really isn't all that bad. I mean, I can think of a whole lot of worse things to lose it to. So it's about 400. Their pro shop is also a home that was there at the time of the battle. The John Miller, military aide to General Cruft from Richmond, he was injured at the battle and he dies there 9 days later. So everybody calls him General. If you ever see anything that says General John Miller, since the fellow passed away last week, I can say this. He had a pocket commission in that if he raised enough men, he got a general star. But he dies before he does it. Thus, he doesn't have a general star. I know that's splitting hairs, but it's true. So, oh, yes, sir.
The area around Richmond,
Got to turn the volume up.
the area around Richmond,
Mm-hmm.
was it predominantly Southern sympathizers or Northern?
It's split, probably a little bit more southern than northern. There are slaveholders there. But one thing people need to remember, in the state of Kentucky, at the beginning of the Civil War, only 23% of the population owned slaves. Well, what does that mean? That means 77% don't. And so there's a whole lot of, people talk about the Civil War was about slavery, so that's true, but there's other things involved here. It's all a mess. So, where the Rogers house is, they had about 15 slaves. Down where Battlefield Park is, the Armstrong family, they only owned 2. And a woman in her 50s and a boy in his 20s. We think they were mother and son, but we can't prove it. So then the Feckheimer family that lived up the road, they were a Jewish family. How did a Jewish family get way out in the middle of central Kentucky at that time? They didn't own any. So it's hodgepodged around a little bit. One thing I think also happened during the years before the Civil War is George has a farm with some slaves. Phil has a farm with some slaves. George over here has a farm with the slaves. Nobody can do their work by themselves. So let's all go to George's farm with all our slaves and we'll plant the corn. Then we come to Phil's farm, we plant the corn. Then we go to George's farm and plant the corn. 4 months later, guess whose crop comes in first? We go over here and harvest the crop. Then we come to me and we harvest the crop. We go over there and harvest the crop. There's a whole lot more sharing going on to help each other because slavery is very, very expensive. And I hate to put a person's freedom and all that with a price on it. But if you look at it, it's very expensive. Yes, sir.
One of the goals of the Confederate invasion of Kentucky was to gather men and materials.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Were there many men that signed up for the Confederate Army from Madison County after the...
Madison County did have a regiment of cavalry raised, the 11th Kentucky, and many of the men who were killed at Green River Bridge or Tibbs Bend were from Madison County. So David Waller Chenault, their colonel, was killed there. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of casualties there, but a lot of them were from Madison County. So, yes, sir.
What happened to Cassius Clay's home once the Confederates...
They just bypassed it. They just didn't pay any attention to it. Of course, Cassius Clay also told Bull Nelson, don't go south of the Kentucky River, sit on the Palisades there. And, well, that didn't happen. Oops. So, no, his home, as far as I know, there was no damage or anything like that. They're just moving too fast. They got this capture the flag mentality. You know, if we capture Frankfort, we get the whole state. Doesn't work that way. Now, they thought it did. But looking back, we know that didn't work. So John Hunt Morgan, in July, when he was doing his raid through Cynthiana and all that, he went back and told Braxton Bragg and Kirby Smith there'd be 20,000 Kentuckians rallied to the Confederate cause. So they brought 20,000 weapons with them, hopefully to sign all these people up. They took back about 18,000 that weren't burned at Camp Dick Robinson or Camp Breckenridge, whichever time you want to call it. So, yes, sir.
Was it the Confederate victory largely attributable to the inexperience of Nelson's troops?
Yes.
Like they were mostly green?
Yes, most of the troops that were in the Union Army at Richmond had not been in the Army but 2 to 3 weeks. Also, the Confederates, everything lined up, the stars lined up for them. The upper command was able to get their middle commanders to understand exactly what to do. There was only one mistake. A Florida artillery unit got too far forward and got riddled, and then they came back and went in with the Texas boys. If you're a novice in Civil War battles, study the Battle of Richmond, because you only have to know one word: flank. If you know what flank means, you've got just about every Civil War battle figured out. And Richmond's a classic example of it. It's also a classic example of the best, or what cavalry is supposed to do with the Confederates, and what cavalry is not supposed to do with the Federals. Leonidas Metcalf, the colonel of the 18th Kentucky Cavalry, refused to command them during the battle. So he left them. He went over to an infantry unit and said, I'll come over and help you guys. They know, thank you. We've got enough problems as it is. So, yes, sir.
Speaking of cavalry, where was Morgan during all this?
Morgan's men are attached to Kirby Smith's army, but they are not at the Battle of Richmond. I don't know exactly where they are. A story that I've heard, and you never, ever let the truth get in the way of a good story, ever, that when Confederates from Richmond marched into Lexington, they were a rough bunch, ragtag bunch, dirty and all that. The story I've heard, and I don't know how true it is, but John Hunt Morgan's men got to Nicholasville. They stopped. Everybody got a bath, and everybody got new uniforms. And then they rode into Lexington the next day. Kind of fits his personality some, I think. Don't know if it's true or not, but who cares? Still a good story. Yes, sir. One more, and then we'll turn it over to the
Why don't you tell us about the incident at the Galt House?
incident at the Galt House. Bull Nelson's wounded at Richmond. We all know that. And he eventually makes it to Louisville. And Don Carlos Buell, now there's another thing we need to realize. There's a lot of internal military politics going on that's not talked about very much. And Bull Nelson and Don Carlos Buell are buds. All right? So Don Carlos Buell puts Bull Nelson in charge of the defenses of Louisville. But he doesn't have any officers. So they start pulling these officers in. And one of the fellows that they pulled in is a fellow named Jefferson C. Davis. Not the Confederate president. It's a different guy. As I said, Bull Nelson's 300 pounds, 6'4", or something like that. Jefferson C. Davis is about 5'5", 100 pounds on a good day. If you look at pictures of him, he looks sick. I mean, they're all black and white, but to me, he has a very sallow, very yellowy look. Well, long story short, they get into an argument. Bull Nelson is general of volunteers. Jefferson C. Davis is in the regular army. So there's some friction there. And Bull Nelson basically, what have you been doing? And Jefferson C. Davis basically says, well, not much. Well, how many men you got? I don't know. Well, how many guns you got? I don't know. And so Bull Nelson relieves him from command and sends him across the river. But he wasn't the only person that day that Nelson got into it with. He got into it with Stephen Burbridge also. Well, Davis was supposed to go to Cincinnati and talk to General Horatio Wright. And he does that. And Horatio Wright tells him, go back to Louisville, go out to your camp on Beargrass Creek, stay out of Nelson's way, it'll all be okay. But Davis doesn't do that. He goes to Indianapolis, and he meets up with one of his buddies up there, Oliver Morton. Anybody know who Oliver Morton is? Very important Civil War figure, governor of Indiana. If they had telephones in the Civil War time and Governor Morton called Lincoln, Lincoln would answer. Very, very influential. So they both come back to Louisville. And on September 30th, or September 29th, 1 month after the Battle of Richmond, Bull Nelson comes down the staircase and asks if General Buell had come down. They said no, so he went into the restaurant and had a bite to eat. And as he went to go out, there was a group of men there with Governor Morton was part of them. Well, out of the back of them steps Jefferson C. Davis. And as I said, Nelson was the most original and elegant swearer in the entire Union Army. Jefferson C. Davis was number 2. Now, there's been some sanitized versions in the newspaper. I don't think they said that. Well, apparently, Davis wadded up a calling card and flicked it in Nelson's face. Well, that just caused him to explode. And he backhands Davis, and they cuss each other some more, and he backhands him again. And Davis storms off. And then Nelson turns to Morton and said, I guess you came here to see me embarrassed. And Morton says, oh, no, wait a minute. So Nelson stomps off. He gets to the base of the stairway there at the Galt House, not the Galt House that's there now. And, well, in the meantime, Jefferson C. Davis has gotten a pistol. And he comes up to Nelson, closer than me, to probably about 10 feet, and lifts it up and says, Nelson, takes care of yourself, and fires. It's a Tranter pistol, has 2 triggers on it. Probably a .36 caliber. That was the most made. We know where the pistol is. We'd love to have it. Gets him right about here. Nelson stumbles up the steps and collapses. And, of course, everybody's coming. This is 6:30 in the morning. Everybody's coming around. And Thomas Crittenden. Everybody know who Thomas Crittenden is? Well, he gets to Nelson, one of the first ones. He and Nelson are buds. Well, the best underserved comment in the entire Civil War. Tom Crittenden looks down at Bull Nelson and goes, Bull, are you hurt? And Tom, I've been basely murdered. And Nelson dies within the hour. And Davis is arrested, but is never really charged with anything. And it just kind of goes away. Buell said he didn't have enough officers to conduct a court-martial. He's got 2 Confederate armies out there in state he's got to worry with. And if it had been anybody else other than Bull Nelson, he might not have gotten away with it. But he did. So then Davis serves with Sherman quite a bit, marched to the sea. He had a habit for leaving slaves on the other side of rivers, and they put the pontoon bridges up. So that's basically what happened in a nutshell. I know Mayor Bly would like to hear all the words that were said, but we can't do that. So now the warm-up act is over. Now it's time for the headliner, one of your very own George Nelson writings. George Nelson writings, yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you. Please, you don't have to stand.
And not yet, but I'm mindful of the time and the hour, but we started a little early, so we'll keep on moving. And Mayor, welcome. We're glad you're here. Thank you. I know you were kind enough to say you had to go to the airport, so that was very kind of you. Appreciate y'all. So that's the history, and kind of following the format that they did with the Perryville meeting, we thought we'd give the history, then talk about kind of the Paul Harvey. I was young enough or old enough to hear Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. So here's a little bit more of the rest of the story. So some of the Battle of Richmond things that we do. Can you hear me okay? I know there's a little bit of a ring. I'm going to slide this down. Maybe that little ring will go away. Is that a little better, less ringy? I had no idea that's still ringing. I was just trying. So in December, Philip and I were ringing the bell with Salvation Army and Walmart in Richmond, so we did that. And then this other photo was at Living History about 3 weeks ago. We had about 120 or so school kids, homeschool kids, a couple other school academies in nearby counties. So thanks to Louetta for organizing our Living History and getting that going again. So real quick, I know a lot of you guys have studied Civil War longer than I've been alive. This theater thing is always an interesting thing. I know some of you that some of these things, this jargon we use sometimes is like, what in the world are they talking about? So you hear about the Eastern Theater, the Western Theater. Eastern Theater is where Robert E. Lee was most of the time till the end of the war. And some things don't make sense. It seems more east or west, but I found this a couple days ago and thought it was a helpful little chart. Trans-Mississippi's where Edmund Kirby Smith ended up command of, and he was in charge of the final surrender of the troops in the Trans-Mississippi, which was, I'm trying to remember, 80,000, something like that, of everybody west of the Mississippi. So battlefield preservation efforts. Stones River, there is a monument to some Kentucky troops, one of the very first monuments that was built on a battlefield in 1863, just a few months after the battle. First Manassas Bull Run, there was a monument 1862, 1863. So a few monuments started going up. Random local efforts. Gettysburg could be a whole talk by an expert about the efforts at Gettysburg in particular. But by the 1890s, there were the first 5 military parks, and they're Chattanooga, Chickamauga, Antietam, Shiloh, Gettysburg, Vicksburg. By the early 1900s, about 10 major battlefields were part of the system under the Army, and they were transferred to the National Park Service by executive order. So this isn't just a new thing. Executive order's been around for a while. Those other initial 10 parks, the other 5, Fort Pulaski in Georgia, Petersburg, Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, which includes the 4 biggest battlefields, my favorite part of battlefield preservation and to go visit. Stones River, east of Nashville, and Fort Donelson. The mid-century, the Civil War centennial, which was coming up in 1961 to 65, led to Civil War roundtables in the 1950s. We were one of the first. We were organized in 1953, and our first meeting was in January of 1954. Louisville began in January 1961. Some folks from Louisville that were coming down here said, well, we'll make one so we don't have to drive so far. I was up there Saturday night. Greg Mertz from Fredericksburg talked about Cedar Mountain. So Louisville has a robust schedule. They have 9 meetings a year. So they still meet at Big Spring Country Club, which is where they had their first meeting back in 1961. We've got a reciprocal agreement with them. Kind of like us, if you don't pay dues, you can pay a little abbreviated membership fee and go to their meetings. So I encourage you to look up their stuff. They have a lot of great programs. Battlefield Protection then kind of slowed down. Ken Burton's miniseries. I can remember recording on VHS. And I still have the VHSs in a box, which doesn't surprise my parents. But of course it's now out on DVD and Blu-ray. So that came out in 1990. Led a great spark of renewal and interest, led to the Ted Turner Civil War movies, Gettysburg and Gods and Generals and other things, and it helped support the cause of battlefield preservation. And incidentally, in November, there will be a Ken Burns American Revolution miniseries coming out in November tied to the 250th American birthday that started in April 19th, commemorating Lexington Concord. So battlefield preservation, I was actually working in Washington, D.C. in 1989 and 90 when there were some threats of development at Manassas. And I remember just getting kind of mad. I was like, well, that ought to be a park. It ought to be saved. But it wasn't. And unfortunately, there were thousands of acres, many battlefields not protected. So Chantilly, not too far outside of D.C., that battlefield was lost. And some key preservationists, Brian Pohanka, who's now passed away, but was in a lot of those Civil War miniseries episodes in the 90s, Bud Hall, some other people got together, and eventually 2 groups were formed to try to save battlefields. In 1999, those groups merged to become the Civil War Preservation Trust. Some of you, I know Michael was on some CWP trips, and Wayne and other folks in here. In 2011, they became the Civil War Trust, and then in 2014, they became the American Battlefield Trust, what they're called today, because the Park Service asked them to help save Revolutionary War battlefields and War of 1812 sites. To date, the trust has saved over 56,000 acres in 25 states, 153 sites, and in Kentucky they've saved a lot of land. We'll talk about that in just a second. The Civil War Sites Advisory Committee was formed in 1990 to look at battlefields and focus on the status of and the dangers to Civil War battlefields. It's about a 63-page report. It really has set the stage for everything that's happened. Any acre of land in Kentucky or in America that's been saved with federal money came as a result of this report. I encourage you to look it up. The CWSAC laid out the framework. There's 4 types of grants, and we've used some of all these in Richmond and across Kentucky. 4 types of grants: 1 to buy the land, 1 to make a plan of what to do with the land if you get it, how to interpret it, signage, trails, those kind of things, and restoration of buildings. They identified 45 sites in America as the decisive battlefields. There are 384 battlefields altogether that they identified where something happened important. So 45 were the big major battlefields. You think of the big ones. 104 were Class B or major. Richmond is one of the Class B. Kentucky has Perryville as Class A, and then Mill Springs, Munfordville, and Richmond are the Class B. So this is a grouping of the battlefields, and there were a few battlefields north and west of Texas, but not the primary. These are the Kentucky battlefields, obviously Perryville first and then the other 3. The American Battlefield Trust has saved over 3,000 acres in Kentucky, many at Mill Springs and Camp Nelson, and obviously at Richmond we've had almost 400 acres. And Perryville, of course, over 1,000 acres. Perryville is considered one of the most pristine and most fully preserved battlefields in America. Somewhere 85 to 95% on how you count it has been saved and preserved, and so that's a great story. So in addition to the 362 acres that have been saved primarily outside of the Army Depot, as Phillip mentioned, some of the actually the most fighting happened inside the Army Depot. So there's 400 acres that was identified by that report that I was telling you about as core battlefield. So some of you may have looked at the Army Depot. My dad in the National Guard in the 60s camped on there. But the yellow outline, that's the 15,000 acres of the Bluegrass Army Depot, started in 1942 as a result of World War II. In the lower left, there's 3 kind of circular regions. That is essentially Highway 421 to 25 up into Richmond. So the cemetery part is the top, where Mayor Blythe, your home, where you've lived your whole life, is in that property at the top. The middle is stage 2 and the bottom is stage 1. So kind of in reverse order of the way Phillip told the battle. If you see the blue down in the bottom left there, that's our park. That's the core battlefield park, close to 400 acres that's been preserved over the years. 2001, next year will be our 25th anniversary of battlefield preservation. Before 2001, there was not any acreage that had easement or was preserved or was a park, you would say. There were a few Kentucky historical markers from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, but that was it. So in 2001, some local folks went to auction. A sign went up and there was 30 days. The auction was going to be in November 2001. And folks went to auction and bought this tract for $750,000. And a local bank helped. The county eventually agreed to create a county park. There was no Madison County Park at that point. It became the park. Then 300 more acres were bought a couple years later. $1 million came from the Kentucky legislature. $1 million came from the American Battlefield Protection Program from the Park Service. That was $2 million to buy that 300 acres. In 2023, the park began a process of being transferred to the city of Richmond, and with the support of Mayor, thank you so much. So, because of the efforts of local, state, national leaders and organizations, the quote I'm getting ready to read to you from 1937 is gratefully no longer true, because now we have several hundred acres protected and preserved, several witness buildings are preserved, over 24 historical interpretive markers are scattered across the 3 phases and across the county. But back in 1937, a book called Old Cane Springs was written, and in the back of that's a roster of the recruitment that happened after the war. You asked about recruitment. The cavalry folks that joined John Hunt Morgan that were at Tibbs Bend, some were killed and captured there, is in this book. But this is the quote that was written by Jonathan Truman Doris, a professor at Eastern Kentucky State Teachers College, as it was when my dad was there. He wrote in 1937, "Unfortunately, there are no markers along the Dixie Highway," that's what Highway 25 was called back then, "going south from Richmond to indicate the stirring days of 1862, when boys in blue and boys in gray engaged in fratricidal warfare
to determine the character of our government. A few old homes at Mount Zion Church, therefore, are left alone in mute testimony to the heroism and suffering of both sides. Surely the view of any one of them should intrigue the imagination and stir the emotions of those who are informed in this period of the history of Madison County. Fortunately, we've got most of those buildings. Unfortunately, a few buildings have been lost since then. So just real quick, there's the map again of where things are. Starting off in the Big Hill, which is where the Confederates landed before the full attack on August 30th. If you ever travel down that road, you see these historical markers. This is where President Grant, before he was president, General Grant, traveled from Tennessee up through and spent the night in the Merritt Jones Tavern, which is the building on the lower right, which is on property owned by Berea College. Unfortunately, it burned about 1990 something, 96, 98, something like that. So I traveled to the ruins, fall of 23, I guess, and those are the chimneys. It just happened. I'm a big fan of Gary Edelman. Many of you know Gary at the Trust. He does all these then and now, lines up. That was pure dumb luck to have that cemetery view or that chimney view with that picture down there. When I saw it, I was like, that's pretty cool. But that was the Confederate route of advance. There's a cemetery behind the tavern from wounded that were taken down there after the battle, a few miles. And until 1972, there were just stones there. But Dr. John B. Floyd from Lexington, I believe, right? Some of you may have known him, probably did. He was probably a member of this group, I'm guessing. He did some research, and they got War Department markers. These are just 3 of the graves. I visited there October, November of 2023 from the different units that were engaged. This is American Battlefield Trust maps the core property. Down here, the blue, that's the 62 acres and the 300 acres that were bought. This little brown, bigger yellow, that is land that was added later, the J. Kernan Farm, those in Richmond know that. The golf course, you mentioned about the golf course. The golf course kind of wraps around that. South of the yellow and west of the yellow, that's the Battlefield Golf Course. But there's a number of houses here, and we'll talk about those just real quick as we wrap up. We're fortunate that Texas chose to put in one of their historical markers just like they put in at Gettysburg and Antietam and Shiloh and Wilderness. It's not as big as the Vicksburg one, but all the rest of them are just like this. That granite from Texas lists the units. Behind this is Churchill's Draw that Phillip referred to, where the troops from Texas and Arkansas marched up on the right flank of the Union Army and attacked them there. So there's walking trails out there, people walking every day. I've spent a lot of time walking out there. It's a beautiful place to go walk. Michigan also memorialized their soldiers. That's Mount Zion Church that you've seen a few times. The Michigan artillery was right there in the road and right there just south of the church. So that's the Michigan markers that you see at Perryville and other places. And Masonic memorials put in, pretty unique. You know, Gettysburg has the famous Masonic memorial. I know there's a few other, but not many. So this is at the Visitor Center at the Rogers House. Another memorial to the Battle of Richmond is kind of odd and obscure, but there is a 12-pounder howitzer that was captured at Shiloh in April of 1862, but then retaken, and at the Battle of Richmond, the South took it again. So that gun tube has been hanging in the Shiloh Visitor Center. I corresponded with the park, and it's been in storage since 2022. So our next mission, folks, is to requisition them. It says, since y'all are going to put it in storage, why don't you send it up here? We'll display it till you're ready to have it back. So, Mayor, we might put together some correspondence to that effect. I've been wanting to do that for 10 years anyway, but I found out, and Phillip, I forwarded you those emails today. So that's pretty cool. It's engraved right on the gun. That's a memorial down in Tennessee. So real quick, the houses that are still standing. The first one we're going to talk about is Pleasant View, which was owned by Joseph Barnett. This is, if you've gone to our reenactments or anything, where the park trail service system is right here. My parents spent many times visiting with the Herndons here at derby parties. I remember going to derby parties and shooting doves in the field behind there. This is right across from the Army Depot. And apparently during World War II, German Afrika Korps prisoners who were at the depot came out and worked in the fields here. This is one of the slave quarters. It's still standing. Not many slave quarters exist. There's also a cemetery on this property which include the families as well as the enslaved people with gravestones and markers naming them, which is a very rare thing as well. So if you've never come to Richmond and walked around, come do that. That trail's open every day. So that's the Rogers house right here in the core. It's the square right there. Am I hitting it right? I can't see that far. Yeah, that's right. It's Barnett's on here, right? So then the Rogers House. This is the visitor center today. It was built in 1811. It was the Army Depot Commander's headquarters from the time the depot began. Then they left it idle for many years, and Senator Bunning's office helped us get this to start the park. It's right on Highway 25. This was chosen to be the visitor center because it was easier to get to than down at Pleasant View. But this was an early morning sunrise that I caught. Got new signs thanks to the city of Richmond, so that was a good thing. The Palmer House is now the Golf Course Pro Shop, and it is where right over in there. So that's where the Churchills draw. The Churchills men came up on the Union right flank. That is the Palmer House, right over in there. So that house was damaged during the battle. Richard Dean, who was an artist in Richmond, painted this huge mural. You can't really get, well, you can kind of get scale in that picture of how big it is. But that was a picture of the house, and Richmond Kiwanis, which I was a member of at the time, they sponsored that and put that in, so that's still there in the pro shop. So there is interpretation at the golf course. So again, the golf course and the subdivisions that went in were the impetus for preservation, but at least we've got some interpretation on the property, and it's called the Battlefield Golf Course, so people at least, if they kind of read and they think, oh, there was a battle here, so at least they're knowing that's happening. Mount Zion Church, we're so fortunate to have. It was built in 1852. The pews that are there are the pews that were field hospital pews during the battle and after the battle. The first chronological Medal of Honor was presented to General Bernard, or at the time he was a captain at Richmond. He was a captain. Bernard Irwin was awarded the Medal of Honor for his service in February of '61 in New Mexico, right? So first chronological Medal of Honor. He didn't receive that for his service here, but he stayed and served the wounded here. After the fighting went on to Richmond, he was behind enemy lines for several days and continued to serve both sides. This is the battle damage right there. It's right above this cross. It's right up there. This is on the south side of the church right there, right above there. So you can go visit that anytime. And Jim Hoffman, who has worked at several of the battlefields, some of you probably know him, he painted this depiction of the locals serving the folks at the church. Castlewood was a home that was destroyed when the Army Depot took over the depot. Cumberland View, Philip referred to it earlier, burned in the 1960s. Its current location of Okanite, which employs over 200 people on about 70 acres. Coming into town, our Madison County Courthouse, that was on a snowy day a couple years ago. This was a picture taken before 1908, because you can see the fence that Philip referred to. That bandstand was taken down during World War II and melted down for scrap as part of scrap drive to make weapons and munitions and ships and planes and tanks, unfortunately. But that's the same fence. That's an enlargement of that picture. And this is the same fence today. That's Main Street. If you've ever driven through Richmond, those are the train tracks going south on Highway 25. That's the same fence. So it's held up pretty well. It was kind of rough there in that zoom in of the picture. The Holloway house that Philip referred to, this home is just right up there. So on the northern side across from the cemetery a few blocks, Colonel William Link, who Philip has portrayed, this monument is right outside, there's that fence again, at the Richmond Cemetery. He was mortally wounded there and died in the house, how many days later?
September 20th.
September 20th, he died in that house. Today it's apartments, but the building is still standing, thank goodness. I'd love to see that someday part of the park and preserved and taken back to its time. But I can spend the government's money just as easy as anybody else. So Mount Pleasant is right up there. That's this house we showed you earlier where the paroles were signed. right up there. So this home was built in 1826, and a businessman bought it and preserved it. It was idle for many years and kind of got damaged, but the parole that you see on the screen is over here on the table, so be sure to come see that on the way. You don't see many paroles. You've probably seen some Appomattox paroles, but maybe no other from other sites. Phillip has been instrumental in getting markers repurposed and available to get interpretation done at places that had not been interpreted. This was just put in, was it Memorial Day last year? So this is in the Richmond Cemetery where we think the Union mass grave was inside the Richmond Cemetery. On the right, I know it's hard to see that, but back in 1950, the American Legion put up this marker memorializing the battlefield and the dead and fallen of both sides. It talks about the Union were taken to Camp Nelson, the Confederates remain. This is the Confederate marker for years, was that small one that says the Southern Dead, which is about the size of one of these books. Maybe a little bigger, but not much. The Sons of Confederate Veterans put this monument up in 2000, 2001, I think. We now have an app. This has just come out in the last 3 or 4 months. If you go to your app store of whatever service you use and you type in Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, you will find it. And it was done with a firm in conjunction with American Battlefield Trust. Some of you probably use some of the great American Battlefield Trust apps. They have about 20. So this was done in coordination with them and linkage to some technological services to do that. Just kind of a final thought. We don't just sit around and wait for August and do things for a weekend and then we wait till the next August to do things. As he said, the motto we use is where the dust never settles, because there's always something going on. Every week or two there's something going on. So we've had reenactments since 2002. I brought one of the posters from, I think, the 5th one. So 2002, we got the property in November 2001. American Battlefield Trust helped us with $10,000 at that auction for that $750,000 purchase. They've helped us since then. Living History Days, we've had years of doing that. It's been a great thing. Community involvement, we do a lot of things in Richmond and the region. We host tour groups all the time. We've got a school group coming May 29th. It's coming for a day. We're doing living history for them. But it's just a park to go out to. Paved trails, it's beautiful. All 4 seasons, people are out there every day, all the time. The Visitor Center, I didn't ask Phillip to tell me numbers of ballpark visitors. Some weeks obviously are busier than others. 5,000 a year or so. And now with Buc-ee's, you know, there are people coming at Buc-ee's. Hey, so you've had people from all sorts of countries. You post people and their dogs or their other pets, which is kind of fun. So if you're a Facebook person, you definitely need to follow our Battle of Richmond page. So a lot more we could talk about, but it's amazing to see what's happened in 24 years. So next year will be our 25th anniversary of preservation, so it'll be a good time to celebrate what's happened. And we thank you for coming down if you've been down once or many times. Come join us again in August. It's always the reenactment's always the weekend before Labor Day. One year we did it Labor Day, thought, hey, the reenactors like to travel on Labor Day. And they were like, no, we want to have Labor Day to ourselves. So it'll never be on a Labor Day weekend ever again until we forget and mess up and change it. But again, on your way out, come up and see these newspapers. They're hard to read, so if you don't have trifocals, you might have a hard time reading the print, but it's just pretty cool to see Richmond in national news, Philadelphia, New York. The commission signed by Lincoln and Stanton, and then the parole, and then also Luetta will be selling books if you'd like to take one or both home. Normally $35, tonight $25 each if you buy them both.